Well, my last book is called Winter Evenings. It's a collection of short stories, and the title story is called Winter Evenings, and that's where the title of the book comes from. These are stories which are, some are published, some are not, never been published before, and which have been written really actually over the last 22 years. And they've been written through the 90s, the last decade of this century, and they cover, I suppose, many, they're placed in different places. About maybe 8 or 10 of them are placed in India, the rest are placed abroad, because I've been living in different parts of the world, and I suppose some of that comes in. They're based in Russia, based in Poland, based in Bhutan, based in Europe, the US, and 8 or 10 are based in India, and mostly in the Indian hills. So they have, I suppose they're linked together more by the mood than by anything else. I think that's why the title Winter Evenings, I suppose, is a very appropriate title, because it's sort of, most of them are in a wintry, cold, hilly setting. And they are sort of the kind of stories which I'd like to think would be the kind of stories which you'd sit and read, or read aloud next to a fire on a wintry evening in a log cabin. So I'm very happy that finally this book of short stories is out. When I wrote them, I didn't think they'd ever come out as a book, because you don't write 25 short stories that this is my book. You write as it comes, and then it's nice to see them now put together. Well, they're really very, very varied. For instance, the title story, Winter Evenings, talks about two men who are locked together in a very lonely place in a hill town, where they have nobody else to talk to who can understand them, so they must get together every evening. And yet they don't actually like each other, but human companionship is so important that they must get together. So even when they fight with each other, they want to still get together the next evening. So, it's that sort of a thing. Then the story I read yesterday at this out at a public reading here was the story of how the ghosts of partition come back to haunt a survivor, a very strong matriarchal lady who survived partition but then collapses when she sees another event around riots in India, and she can't take it anymore. There are other stories, there are many stories which deal with human relationships, of the marital relationships, divorce, extramarital affairs, and the impact on relationships. There are stories which deal with greed. There are stories which deal with human side of people who seemingly look very strict and very officious, but actually have a streak of wanting to be adventurous. There are stories which deal with the divides that we see in India, how helpless sometimes you see when you see a social wrong or poverty, and the conflicting situations that arises. I mean, there are all sorts of subjects, but essentially it's about, I suppose, like all stories, they're about human beings. Well, I suppose I wanted to be a fiction writer, and I started with a lot of literary journalism, and then I moved into short stories, and then I was trying to work short stories, and I was very fortunate that the very first short story I wrote, I think it was 1988, I didn't know where to send it, so I heard on the old days in the BBC shortwave radio, they used to have a program called Short Story, which used to run out of BBC Wales. I sent it to them and they picked it up, and that was very encouraging. And it was then, after that, 4 or 5 of my short stories were broadcast over BBC, and then I got more encouraged and I sent them to literary magazines. The London magazine in England used to be a very nice place for starting writers, and there were Alan Ross, who was the editor, who I'm also acknowledged in this book, gave a lot of opening to young Indian writers, and he published a few of my stories, and that's how it went. I am not at all a diaspora writer. In fact, I see myself as a very rooted Indian writer. I'm very proud of the fact. I have been traveling, but I've been working in a diplomatic capacity, so I'm never out of the Indian confine. In an Indian embassy, you're in India. So I wouldn't put myself as a diaspora writer, although I've lived in many countries. So I think my concerns are very Indian. They are not diasporic concerns. They're very, the conflicts of India, the traditional conflicts, the modern conflicts, the Indian setting. It's very dear to me, and that's what I like to write about. Well, I think it doesn't. That doesn't depend upon what profession you do. I mean, you might be working in a village and be cut off from the common man. And you might be, dealing with kings, queens, ambassadors and prime ministers, and you may still be able to see the concerns of the common man, whether it's the boy who's serving the coffee or the guy you meet in the hotel lobby who's sitting and polishing shoes. So I think that your profession has nothing to do with it. I'm very, very thankful that I haven't lost any touch for the common man. A number of my stories, in fact, deal with the common man. There is a story about a young boy. I don't know if you remember, in the old days, they used to come into weddings and sing on a harmonium. And this is a story about a young boy who's one of those boys who's singing on a harmonium, and he gets kicked out of the wedding, and what happens to him. And there are stories about prostitutes. There are stories about a very junior inspector in a very remote station who's a customs inspector. So no, I hope I haven't lost any touch with the common man. Well, I think this is a very strange alchemy which happens, because you see something and then it keeps changing in your head and it becomes another character. Then somewhere you hear somebody say something, and the character and somebody you may have seen somewhere fits into that story as a character. So I suppose ultimately it's everything that you have seen goes into your writing, or you have thought, or you have heard. But it's not that they appear the same way in your writing. People undergo a lot of changes. I have lived in the hills many places. I like visiting the Indian hills, and I think a lot of that is the influence of there, and there is something about the remoteness of Indian hills. There is something about people in a remote setting trying to live their lives, and I think I've always found that very evocative. And I still like to go back to the hills whenever I can. So I think that's really my favorite part of India. In the hills, I think one story of mine, the title story, is actually set in a remote valley in Bhutan. Then there is a story which is set in Mashobra near Simla. There's a story which is set in, it doesn't say so, but I know it is set in a small town called Nahan, in the foothills of Himachal. There's a story which is set in the hills of South India, between Kerala and Karnataka, the tea and coffee slopes. So these are some of the places. Well, I have a number of things in the pipeline. I'm just finishing a set of partition stories, translations from Punjabi to English, which were written by my father in Punjabi, and I'm putting them out in English, so that book should be out this year. Then I hope to be writing a history travel kind of narrative about Jerusalem, which is still in the pipeline. So there are a number of things happening.